Highland Heights, October 2012. Inside a sterile interrogation room, a 21-year-old honor student is left alone. She isn't trembling. Instead, she stands and begins to twirl. Shayna Hubers hums Amazing Grace to the security camera, her silhouette spinning against the gray cinder blocks. Moments ago, she confessed to pumping 6 rounds into her boyfriend, telling detectives she finally gave him the nose job he wanted. This is the reality of a killer who didn't just pull the trigger. She danced on his grave. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Ryan Poston was a man built from the high expectations and deep roots of northern Kentucky, a 29-year-old whose life was measured in billable hours and the quiet pride of a family that saw him as their greatest achievement. He lived in a world of legal briefs, leather-bound volumes, and the sharp, clean air of Highland Heights. Born into a family that valued intellect and community service, Ryan had never been one to shy away from the hard work of living up to his name. He was a graduate of Indiana University and later the Salmon P. Chase College of Law, a place where the curriculum was designed to break the weak. But Ryan had emerged not just with a degree, but with a reputation for being a rare breed, an attorney who actually cared about the people behind the paperwork. In his law practice in Cincinnati, he was becoming a formidable force in personal injury law, representing those who had been overlooked or cast aside by the system. His colleagues described him as a man with a brilliant legal mind, but they spoke even more frequently about his striking blue eyes and the way he could disarm a room with a single, self-deprecating joke. He was the kind of person who seemed to have a natural gravitational pull, someone who stayed late at the office not for the overtime, but because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving a task unfinished. Standing over 6 feet tall and meticulously fit, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had finally grown into his own skin. His home was a reflection of his rising status, a modern, impeccably kept condominium in Highland Heights. It was a place of glass, steel, and order. Located in a quiet community where the most exciting event of the week was often the local high school football game. Ryan was a man of strict routines. He liked his coffee strong, his shirts professionally pressed, and his weekends spent with his close-knit family in nearby Fort Thomas. His mother and his father, Jay Poston, were his anchors. He was the eldest of 3 sisters, and to them, he was more than just a brother. He was a protector, a confidant, and a constant source of laughter. To the Poston family, Ryan was the golden boy, not because he was flawless, but because he was genuine. He had a way of making the people around him feel like they were the only people in the room. Across the state in Lexington, another story was unfolding, one framed by the cold, unforgiving light of academic perfection. Shayna Hubers was 21 years old, a student at the University of Kentucky who functioned with the intensity of a high-performance machine. To her professors and peers, she was an enigma, a psychology major with a near-perfect GPA who seemed to treat every assignment as a battle to be won. She was articulate, poised, and possessed a vocabulary that she used as both a shield and a weapon. Those who shared classrooms with her in Lexington remembered her as intense, the kind of student who sat in the front row, challenged the curriculum, and never accepted anything less than total victory in a debate. She was fascinated by the darker corners of the human psyche, spending her nights researching personality disorders and the mechanics of manipulation, topics she discussed with a detached, clinical fascination that often made her classmates uncomfortable. She had grown up in a middle-class environment where her intelligence was her primary currency. Shayna was the girl who didn't just meet standards, she sought to redefine them. But beneath the veneer of the honor student and the overachiever, there was a jagged, desperate need for attention that grades alone couldn't satisfy. Her social media presence was a curated museum of her own life, a place where she documented her thoughts and movements with a meticulousness that suggested she was constantly performing for an audience. While Ryan's life was built on the tangible reality of the law, family, and physical fitness, Shayna's life was increasingly built on the digital landscape of validation and perceived status. She was a woman who didn't just want to be loved, she wanted to be the protagonist of an all-consuming narrative. In late 2011, Highland Heights was a town of quiet streets and manicured lawns, a place where people moved to escape the noise of the city. It was the kind of community where a domestic disturbance was a rare, shocking event, something that happened in other places to other people. Ryan Poston was a fixture of this community, a man who represented its best aspirations. Shayna Hubers was a visitor from a different world, a world of obsessive digital connection and academic pressure. They were two paths moving at high speed toward an intersection that neither of them could see coming. Ryan was looking for someone to share his success with, someone who could match his wit and appreciate his ambition. Shayna was looking for a person who could serve as the ultimate prize in her personal psychodrama. The contrast was absolute: the man who spent his days advocating for others, and the woman who spent her nights obsessing over herself. The collision was inevitable, and it would leave the golden boy silent and the honor student dancing in a room with no windows. The spark that ignited the tragedy didn't occur in a crowded room or through a chance meeting at a Lexington coffee shop. It began with the clinical blue glow of a Facebook friend request. In late 2011, Shayna Hubers reached out to Ryan Poston, a simple digital gesture that Ryan accepted with the casual indifference of a man who had no idea he was inviting a predator into his life. For Ryan, Shayna was an intelligent, academically driven student who could hold her own in a debate, a welcome change from the superficiality he often encountered. But for Shayna, Ryan was more than a boyfriend. He was the ultimate acquisition. The relationship didn't evolve so much as it metastasized. Within weeks, the digital footprint of their connection became a terrifying record of one-sided obsession. Shayna didn't just communicate, she inundated. Her presence in Ryan's life was marked by the relentless buzz of his smartphone, a sound that would eventually trigger a physical sense of dread in the young attorney. Investigators would later be stunned by the sheer volume of her output, messages numbering in the thousands, sometimes exceeding 70 to 100 texts in a single 24-hour period. If Ryan didn't respond within her self-imposed time frame, the messages shifted from flirtatious to vitriolic. She demanded to know his location, the names of his companions, and the contents of his thoughts. She was attempting to map every inch of his existence, leaving no room for a life that didn't include her. As 2012 progressed, the dynamic settled into an exhausting, toxic loop. Ryan would reach a breaking point, smothered by the weight of her demands, and attempt to end the relationship, only for Shayna to deploy a sophisticated arsenal of manipulation to pull him back. She was a psychology major who understood the levers of human emotion. She would oscillate between being the perfect girlfriend and a woman on the verge of a total psychological collapse. She used threats of self-harm and elaborate displays of grief to anchor herself to Ryan's inherent sense of decency. Ryan admitted to his friends that he felt a profound sense of pity for her. He saw her as a brilliant girl who was deeply off, and he felt a responsibility to help her find balance. He didn't realize that his compassion was being used as a leash. Ryan's inner circle watched this erosion of his personality with growing alarm. His best friends noticed that the once confident golden boy was becoming distracted and increasingly anxious. During their nights out in Cincinnati or Fort Thomas, Ryan was never truly present. His eyes were constantly darting to his phone, bracing for the next wall of text. He began to describe the relationship as a job, a project he was failing to complete. One specific incident stayed with his friends, a night when Ryan sat in the dark of his Highland Heights condo, refusing to turn on the lights or make a sound, while Shayna stood on his porch and knocked for hours. She didn't scream or make a scene, she simply waited in the silence. A patient sentry convinced that her persistence would eventually break his will. The stalking behavior began to bleed into his professional life. She would show up at his law office, uninvited, creating awkward encounters with his colleagues. To the outside world, she maintained the facade of the devoted, supportive partner. But to Ryan, she was becoming a source of genuine fear. He told his father, Jay, that he was walking on eggshells, worried that any attempt to finally, truly leave would result in a catastrophe. He was a man who understood the mechanics of conflict through the law, but he was completely unequipped for the irrational, narcissistic rage of a woman who viewed his autonomy as an act of betrayal. By the summer of 2012, Ryan was desperately looking for a way out. He began to distance himself more permanently, but Shayna's grip only tightened. She would send him photos of herself crying, followed by messages claiming she was the only one who truly loved him for who he was. She had created a narrative where they were twin flames, two brilliant minds against a world that didn't understand them. But for Ryan, the fire was consuming him. He was losing weight, his work was suffering, and the meticulously ordered life he had built was being swallowed by the chaos she brought across the state line from Lexington. The contrast between the life Ryan wanted and the reality he was living became stark when he met Audrey Bolt, a former Miss Ohio. Audrey represented everything Shayna was not. She was stable, successful, and lived in the same world of professional poise that Ryan occupied. When Ryan began to talk to Audrey, he saw a glimpse of a future free from the digital shackles of Highland Heights. He felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. But Shayna was watching. She monitored his interactions and sensed the shift in his energy. To her, Audrey Bolta wasn't just a romantic rival. She was a threat to Shayna's carefully constructed reality. In the weeks leading up to the final confrontation, Shayna's messages took on a darker, more possessive tone. She stopped asking for his time and started demanding it as her right. She viewed Ryan as an extension of herself, an object that belonged to her by right of her superior intellect and the sacrifice she claimed to have made for the relationship. Ryan's friends begged him to get a restraining order, to change his locks, to disappear. But Ryan believed he could handle it. He believed that if he was just firm enough, if he was just clear enough, she would finally understand that it was over. He was a man who believed in the power of words to resolve disputes. He didn't know that for Shayna Hubers, the conversation was already over, and the only thing left was the performance of the end. The digital obsession had reached its zenith. Every buzz of the phone was a reminder that he was not free. Every knock on the door was a reminder that his sanctuary was compromised. As October 12th approached, Ryan Poston believed he was preparing for a new beginning, a date with a woman who made him feel like the man he used to be. He didn't know that Shayna was also preparing, not for a breakup, but for a permanent solution to the man who dared to try and walk away from her. He could smell the scent of her perfume lingering in his guest room weeks after she'd stayed there, a cloying, sweet aroma that felt like a marking of territory. He found her hairs on his pillows, a physical manifestation of an intruder he couldn't quite evict. The silence of the condo when she wasn't there was heavy, pregnant with the expectation of her return. Ryan was living in a state of hypervigilance, his ears tuned to the sound of tires on the gravel or the faint click of the gate. He was a prisoner in a home he paid for, bound by a digital cord that Shayna refused to cut. The honor student had successfully turned his life into a psychological thriller, and as the autumn air turned cold in Highland Heights, the final act was about to begin. October 12th, 2012, began as the first day of what Ryan Poston believed would be his true independence. For months, the 29-year-old attorney had been trapped in the gravity of a relationship that felt less like a partnership and more like a long-term siege. But that Friday was different. He had finally been clear. He had been firm. He told his family and his colleagues that the cycle with Shayna Hubers was over. Not a temporary pause, but a permanent severance. He was a man who appreciated order, and he spent the early evening hours restoring it to his Highland Heights condominium. He moved with a sense of purpose, preparing for a date with Audrey Bolt, the former Miss Ohio. This wasn't just a social engagement, it was a symbolic crossing of a threshold. He was stepping back into the world of the living, leaving the shadow of Shayna's obsession behind him. The condo was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hallway. Ryan stood in front of his bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie. He was a man who took pride in his appearance, standing over 6 feet tall with the lean, athletic build of someone who spent his limited free time in the gym. He looked at the reflection of a successful lawyer, a man whose future was once again his own to shape. The air in the room was cool, conditioned against the lingering humidity of the Kentucky autumn. He had no way of knowing that the silence of his sanctuary was about to be shattered by the very person he thought he had finally escaped. Around 8:50 p.m., the door to the condo opened. Shayna Hubers didn't need to force her way in. She still possessed a key, a metal tether she refused to relinquish. She didn't arrive with suitcases to move out. She arrived with the heavy, jagged weight of a woman who had realized her leverage was gone. She had learned about the date with Audrey. She knew that Ryan was, for the first time, truly looking past her. To a narcissist, abandonment is not just a heartbreak. It is a total annihilation of the self. If she could not be the center of his world, she would ensure that his world ceased to exist. The confrontation didn't begin with screams that the neighbors could hear through the walls. It began in the kitchen and dining area, a space of granite countertops and modern appliances that now served as the stage for a psychological standoff. Ryan was sitting at the dining table, perhaps still wearing his suit trousers, trying to maintain the professional composure that was his trademark. He used the language of the law, measured, logical, and firm. He told her she needed to leave. He told her that he was moving on. He told her that there was no version of the future that included her. But Shayna wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his mouth move, seeing the man she owned dare to speak of a life without her. The tension in the room escalated with a sickening velocity. Shayna would later claim that Ryan became violent, that he pushed her, that he threw her against the furniture. But the room remained eerily pristine. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, no signs of the life or death struggle she would eventually describe to detectives. There was only the .38 caliber handgun. It was Ryan's weapon, kept for protection in a world where he often dealt with volatile legal clients. Shayna reached for it. The cold, heavy steel of the revolver felt like the only thing in the world that was real. In an instant, the power dynamic of the last 3 years was condensed into the pull of a trigger. The first shot was a concussive blast that ripped through the quiet of the condo. The lead projectile struck Ryan square in the chest, a massive, blunt force that collapsed his lung and sent him spiraling off his chair. He hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, his body instantly going into shock. He wasn't dead, but he was neutralized. He lay there, gasping for air that his chest could no longer contain, looking up at the woman who had spent thousands of hours professing her love for him. Shayna didn't pause. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the gun in a fit of sudden remorse. She stepped toward the man on the floor. The second and third shots followed in rapid succession. She fired into his back as he tried to curl away, a primitive, desperate attempt to shield his vitals from the heat and the lead. The room began to fill with the acrid, metallic scent of cordite, a smell that is thick, biting, and stays in the back of the throat long after the smoke has cleared. The sound of the shots was deafening in the confined space, a series of rhythmic explosions that signaled the end of Ryan Poston. As Ryan lay dying on his own floor, his life's blood beginning to pool on the wood, Shayna delivered the most chilling blows of all. She stood directly over him, a bird's-eye view of the man she had shattered. She pointed the barrel at his temple and fired. The fourth shot entered his brain, extinguishing the light of the brilliant attorney instantly. But even with the life gone from his eyes, she wasn't finished with the performance. She aimed the .38 directly at his nose. She pulled the trigger a fifth time. The bullet tore through his facial structure, a disfiguring, unnecessary shot that served no purpose other than to humiliate the corpse. This was the shot she would later describe with a haunting, casual detachment as giving him the nose job he always wanted. It was a final act of spite against a man who was no longer there to feel it. A sixth shot rang out, a stray round fired in the frantic, adrenaline-fueled climax of her rage. Then the silence returned. The condo was still again, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Shayna stood in the center of the room, the revolver still warm in her hand. She looked down at Ryan. He was no longer the golden boy of northern Kentucky. He was a collection of exit wounds and ruined potential. She didn't run to the phone to save him. She didn't try to stem the bleeding with a towel. She walked through the condo. She looked at herself in the mirror. She waited. She spent the next 10 to 15 minutes in a state of eerie, calculated processing. She wasn't just a killer. She was a student of psychology, and she was already beginning to draft the story she would tell. She needed to be the victim. She needed the 6 holes in Ryan's body to look like an act of desperate survival. She waited until she was certain that no medical intervention could bring him back. Only when the silence of the room felt absolute did she pick up her phone and dial 911. The voice that reached the emergency dispatcher wasn't a scream for help. It was a measured, almost clinical report. She told the operator that she had killed her boyfriend. She said he was beating her, and she had to do it. But even as the words left her mouth, she was surrounded by the evidence of her own narcissism. 6 shell casings, a man shot in the back, an execution-style wound to the face. When the Highland Heights police arrived, they expected a chaotic domestic scene. Instead, they found Shayna Hubers waiting for them, her clothes stained with the man she claimed to love, and an expression on her face that was neither grief nor terror. It was the look of someone who had just finished a difficult task and was waiting for the grade. One officer noticed that Ryan's date clothes, the suit, the polished shoes, were still neatly laid out, a heartbreaking reminder of the life he was supposed to lead that night. As they led her out into the cold October air, past the neighbors who were beginning to gather on their porches, Shayna didn't hang her head. She looked at the flashing blue and red lights with a strange, detached curiosity. She had ended the life of the Golden Boy, and in her mind, the night hadn't ended in a murder. It had ended in a victory. She had ensured that Ryan Poston would never go on another date, never win another case, and never, ever leave her again. The dancing killer was born in the blood-slicked dining room of a Highland Heights condo, and the performance was only just beginning. The transition from the blood-slicked hardwood of the condominium to the sterile, flickering fluorescent lights of the Highland Heights Police Department was seamless for Shayna Hubers. She sat in the small interrogation room, her hands still stained with the lead and copper residue of the .38 caliber rounds she had pumped into Ryan Poston's body. The air in the room was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and the cold, metallic scent of the handcuffs that had recently bitten into her wrists. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't ask for water. She began to speak to the empty air and the hidden lens of the security camera, with a volume and a frequency that suggested she was performing for a global audience, not just a few stunned detectives in the observation room. Her behavior over the next several hours would become the centerpiece of the dancing killer moniker. Left alone to contemplate the fact that she had just ended a human life, Shayna didn't collapse into the heavy, soul-crushing grief one might expect. Instead, she stood up from her chair and began to move. The security footage captured a scene that defied conventional psychology. Shayna began to twirl. She spun in circles, her arms slightly raised, humming a melody that the detectives eventually identified as Amazing Grace. She looked at her reflection in the two-way mirror and began to sing the lyrics, her voice thin and eerie in the soundproofed room. She paced the perimeter of the floor, occasionally stopping to check her appearance, seemingly more concerned with how she looked on camera than the fact that Ryan Poston lay in a morgue. When the detectives finally sat across from her, the narrative she presented was a jarring mixture of rehearsed self-defense and unfiltered narcissistic rage. She spoke about Ryan as if he were a problematic project she had finally been forced to terminate. She told the investigators that Ryan was a very vain man, someone who spent too much time worrying about his looks and his status in the community. It was during this clinical deconstruction of his character that she uttered the phrase that would haunt the Poston family forever. She explained with a chillingly casual shrug that since Ryan had always talked about wanting a nose job, she had finally given him the one he wanted by shooting him in the face. She spoke about the disfigurement of his corpse, not with horror, but with the smug satisfaction of someone who had delivered a witty punchline. The lack of empathy in the room was absolute. She described the act of pulling the trigger 6 times as if she were describing a difficult chores she had finally completed. She told the officers that she was a straight A student and a good person, repeatedly pivoting the conversation back to her own accomplishments and the potential damage this incident might do to her academic career. She asked the detectives if she would be able to go back to school on Monday, or if they could at least let her check her phone so she could see her messages. The man she claimed to love was dead by her own hand, yet her primary concern was the disruption of her digital life and her GPA. She spoke about the shooting in the passive voice, as if the gun had simply gone off in her hand. But her details about the final shots, the ones delivered while Ryan lay defenseless, were too specific to be anything other than intentional. As the night wore on, her victim narrative began to fray at the edges. She told the police that Ryan had been abusive, that he had thrown her against the wall, and that she feared for her life. However, when the officers asked her to show them any marks, bruises, or signs of a struggle, she had nothing to offer. Her skin was pristine. Her clothes, though stained with Ryan's blood, were not torn. The detectives noted that she didn't seem to understand the gravity of the physical evidence. She believed that her superior intellect and her ability to articulate her feelings would be enough to override the forensic reality of the crime scene. She spent hours explaining why she was the real victim in the relationship, detailing every slight and every argument they had ever had, while Ryan's body was being processed only a few miles away. The social echo of her arrest began to ripple through Highland Heights as the sun rose the following morning. Rumors of the honor student who sang in the interrogation room started to leak out, transforming the local atmosphere from one of quiet suburban safety to one of profound unease. People who had known Shayna at the University of Kentucky were forced to reconcile the girl they saw in the front row of their psychology classes with the woman who was now being described as a cold-blooded executioner. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. To the public, she was a monster. To the detectives, she was a fascinating study in narcissistic personality disorder. But to herself, she was still the star of the show. She told the investigators that she knew she was very intelligent and that they would likely find her fascinating. She seemed to enjoy the attention, leaning into the camera and adjusting her hair as if she were being interviewed for a documentary. Even as they told her she was being charged with murder, her reaction was muted, focused entirely on how she could frame the story to the media. She was already building the defense that would dominate the next decade of her life, a story of a battered woman pushed to the brink. But as the detectives looked at the footage of her dancing alone in that room, they knew that the truth was much darker. They weren't looking at a woman in shock. They were looking at a killer who felt a profound sense of relief now that her possession could never walk away again. The interrogation ended not with a confession of guilt, but with Shayna Hubers asking if she could have a snack, her appetite seemingly unaffected by the 6 bullets she had just used to silence the golden boy of Kentucky. While Shayna performed for the cameras in the interrogation room, the Highland Heights forensics team was methodically dismantling her reality inside Ryan's condominium. They began with the floor, a map of dark, drying fluid and brass casings. 6 spent shells told a story that was diametrically opposed to her claims of a desperate struggle for survival. Investigators noted the placement of each shell with clinical precision. They weren't scattered in the frantic chaos of a fight, but clustered in a way that suggested a steady, advancing shooter who was in complete control of the space. The first forensic hurdle for the defense was the state of the dining area itself. It was eerily pristine. The table wasn't overturned. The chairs were largely in place, and Ryan's half-eaten meal sat undisturbed next to his glasses. There were no broken ornaments or scuff marks on the walls to support a narrative of a violent, room-clearing brawl. The autopsy was the centerpiece of the investigation, a cold, anatomical post-mortem that stripped away Shayna's adjectives and replaced them with the unforgiving physics of ballistics. The medical examiner identified 6 distinct entrance wounds, each one a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit the battered woman defense. The most damning evidence lay in the trajectory of the lead. The first shot had struck Ryan in the chest while he was still seated, the projectile traveling at a slightly downward angle. This immediately contradicted the claim of an imminent physical attack. If Ryan had been lunging at her with the intent to kill, the bullet would have entered at a flat or upward trajectory. Instead, the forensics suggested a man sitting in his own home, looking up at a woman who was already pointing a barrel at his heart. As Ryan fell from his chair and hit the hardwood, the forensic evidence showed that the shooter didn't pause. They found evidence of 2 shots fired directly into his back, wounds that could only be sustained if the victim was turning away or already incapacitated on the ground. One bullet had traveled through his torso at an angle that suggested he was curled in a primitive fetal position, trying to protect his vitals as the lead continued to fly. This wasn't a woman firing in a blind panic. This was a shooter finishing off a target that was no longer a threat. The bloodstain pattern analysis reinforced this. The primary pool of blood was concentrated where Ryan lay on the floor, with smaller secondary trails indicating he had tried to crawl or turn in his final moments of consciousness. The absence of high-velocity impact spatter on the walls at a height of 5 or 6 feet effectively ended the standing struggle theory. Everything significant had happened at ground level. The nose job shot, the 5th round, was the forensic climax of the investigation. The bullet had entered the bridge of Ryan's nose and traveled straight down into his throat. For this specific trajectory to occur, Ryan had to be lying flat on his back while Shayna stood directly over his head, pointing the revolver vertically downward. It was a shot of pure, unadulterated malice. There was no tactical reason to fire into a man's face after he had already taken 4 rounds to the torso and brain. It was a forensic signature of spite, a final disfiguring act of ownership over a man who had dared to try and leave her. Back at the station, the physical examination of Shayna Hubers yielded nothing but more suspicion. The nurse and the detectives who processed her noted a complete lack of defensive wounds. Her fingernails weren't broken. There were no red marks on her neck. And there was no bruising on her arms that would indicate she had been fighting for her life. Her hair was neat and her makeup was largely intact. The vicious beating she described simply hadn't left a single physical mark on her body. The only biological evidence on Shayna was the blood of the man she had just dismantled. The digital forensics team added another layer of concrete to the prosecution's case. Technicians recovered the deleted history of her obsession, a digital trail of stalking that stretched back through the entire 3-year relationship. They found evidence that she had been monitoring Ryan's communications and that she knew exactly who Audrey Bolta was. The motive recovered from the silicon and code wasn't fear. It was the oldest, most predictable catalyst in the history of crime: jealousy. Forensic psychologists analyzed her interrogation tapes and noted that her Amazing Grace performance was entirely devoid of the physiological markers of shock. Her heart rate had remained stable throughout the evening. Her breathing was controlled, and her focus remained entirely on her own image. She wasn't a woman in the throes of a psychological break. She was a woman who was finally savoring the total control she had achieved over Ryan's existence. The weapon itself, a Sig Sauer .38 caliber revolver, was tested for functionality. There was no mechanical failure and no evidence of a hair trigger. Every round required a deliberate, heavy pull of the trigger. To fire 6 times meant making 6 separate, conscious decisions to end a life. The investigation concluded that Shayna Hubers didn't act in the heat of a moment. She acted with a terrifying, mechanical precision. By the time the lead detectives finished their report, the case was airtight. The forensics had effectively silenced Shayna's voice. She could dance, she could sing, and she could tell stories about nose jobs. But the lead in Ryan Poston's body spoke a truth that no amount of singing could ever drown out. The condo in Highland Heights was no longer just a home. It was a forensic blueprint of an execution. Witness testimony from Ryan's friends and the Miss Ohio contestant, Audrey Bolt, provided the final timeline that trapped her. Audrey told detectives about the plans they had for that night, a simple dinner that Ryan was genuinely excited for. Her testimony proved that Ryan was mentally and emotionally miles away from Shayna. He was a man starting over. This provided the why that the forensics had already established. Shayna knew the clock was ticking on her influence. If she couldn't have the golden boy, then no one would. The investigation painted a picture of a calculated ambush, a woman who arrived at 8:50 p.m. because she knew her window of opportunity was closing at 9 p.m. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to ensure the date with Audrey Bolt never happened. The legal battle in Campbell County was a marathon of chilling testimony and procedural shocks. In 2015, the first jury saw through the battered woman defense, delivering a guilty verdict and a 40-year sentence. But a staggering oversight nearly derailed justice. It was discovered that one of the jurors was a convicted felon, legally barred from serving. This forced a complete retrial in 2018. The second trial was even more grueling. The prosecution leaned heavily on the nose job comment and the interrogation tapes. showing the jury the girl who danced while her boyfriend's body was still warm. The defense fought to paint Ryan as a controlling monster, but the 6 bullet holes told a different story. In August 2018, the second jury returned after only 5 hours of deliberation. Guilty. This time, the judge handed down a life sentence, ensuring the woman who laughed at her victim would have decades to contemplate his silence. For the Poston family, the gavel's final strike brought a heavy, hard-won peace, a definitive end to the digital ghost story. The Highland Heights condo has new tenants now, the walls patched and the blood scrubbed away. But the shadow of that October night remains, a reminder of how easily obsession can turn into execution. Ryan Poston was a man of the law, silenced by someone who viewed his life as a prop for her own drama. Today, Shayna Hubers is just a number in a Kentucky cell. No cameras to twirl for, no audience to manipulate. Only the silence of a life sentence and the echoes of the song she sang in the dark. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.